Okay, folks, chapter 30, and we're going to be discussing modernism in the United States and in Mexico from 1900 to 1945. We discussed modernism that's happening in Europe during 1900 to 1945, and now we're going to discuss what's happening over here where we are during this time. Now, at this moment, a handful of American artists are actually going to make their way to Europe. And like Mary Cassatt that we saw with Mother and Child was one of the major Impressionist painters during the time of Monet and Degas. And so that, and just before the Post-Impressionists. And so she, really paved her way over there in Europe. And that's because of transatlantic travel. So being able to get overseas from the Americas over to the European areas, because America was not very connected to Europe much in general during this time. So a lot of the artwork will look like realist artwork, like the European realists that we saw. But it's slowly going to change, but it's not. It's only the artists that really went over to Europe and lived in Europe where they expanded their field of study beyond the realism, which came after Romanticism. And remember, realism was a focus on connecting with the Enlightenment and the elements of positivism as well as empirical observation. So that's what realism was very much about. And so there's going to become the America realist, and that's going to develop during this time, during the early 1900s. But there is going to be a show, the Armory Show is what it's called, and it's actually going to bring a lot of very famous paintings and artwork from Europe to America, and it's going to be that show in particular that first is going to be heavily criticized, but then after the criticism it's going to receive acclaim, and it's going to develop what will be called the American modernist. Okay. And one painting in particular that really stood out with a lot of criticism as well as ultimately embrace was Duchamp's nude Descending a Staircase, number 2, figure 30.3. And that's where we're going to start, figure 30.3. Now, it's called number 2 because he had the original, and he was asked to show a copy of the original whenever he was in Paris. And ship it over to this Armory Show, but he never wanted to duplicate anything. So he redid it a second time, and then he sent that over to this Armory Show in America. And so figure 30.3 is called number 2 because it was the second one that was made. He didn't do it for production reasons. It was just part of his conceptualism. And if you remember, Marcel Duchamp was the one who did the fountain, which was the urinal that was flipped up on its side and then spelled Armut 1917 on the side. So he was part of the Dadaist movement before he became a surrealist. So he took a technique from Nude Descending the Staircase that he did during the same time, and then he replicated it and did it again and sent it over. And then this ultimately got so much acclaim that they wanted to show it again, but he would not show a piece twice in any gallery. It was just Duchamp's decision. So what he did, he unraveled the whole painting and put it in a box and sent the box full of the string raffled up in the paint, or the painting of the strings raveled up into a ball inside of this box, sent it to the gallery owner, and there it was. They opened the box and they were like, this isn't the painting, but it was the same painting, well, not the same painting, it was a similar painting, but then it was all done in string. So really quite something. And then he ultimately installed it, and he strung the string throughout the whole gallery, and that was a subsequent Nude Descending a Staircase, like number 4 or something like that. So it just shows how his conceptual thinking had a lot to do with his artwork. But anyway, this painting in particular, Nude Descending the Staircase, was introduced in 1912 or 1913, and it really upset people, the American realists in particular, during this time, and it showed how very minimal the influence of the Impressionist, Post-Impressionist, and the Cubist and the Futurist and all these different movements that went on that we covered in the last chapter hadn't quite influenced America yet. And that was very obvious when they sent work like this over. So people were very upset and they didn't like it and they maligned it. They thought that it was kind of cancerous in nature, if you will. But it did at the same time, in time, over a few years, it developed the American modernist. And we'll talk about some of that here in a little bit. So we are going to break up this chapter into what's happening in the United States and with modernism. Then we'll talk about Mexico, and then with Mexico we'll talk about like Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo, and then coupled with that we'll talk about what's happening in architecture at the same time. So we'll be getting into that in the next video. So what Duchamp was doing here is he was actually combining two of those different schools that we looked at. He was combining the Cubist, the analytic Cubist at that. And if you remember what that's all about, it's all about boiling things down to simple forms. And so if you have something that's kind of rectilinear in nature, let's say like your thoracic cavity or your upper body, that's going to be broken down into simple geometric rectangular shapes. Then it's going to be reordered and restructured and reorganized to create something that looks recognizable. Okay, so with the title incorporated here, Nude Descending Down a Staircase, it does look as if at least a figure, though a cubist, analytic figure at that, is descending down the staircase. And then the other school, as you should notice, is the Futurism school. So the futurist, he's wanting to show that moving forward down a staircase, like what we saw with Bala's little dog that was tied to the rope or the chain to the owner, and the little feet and the little tail and the ears were all moving, and they created a system of patterns, very simple patterns that made it look like the object, in that case the dog, was in motion. And then here what Duchamp is doing is he's taking different analytic cubist elements, like these simple forms and shapes, and then he's piling them on top of each other, almost like overlaid film strips, to create this level of motion and kinetics. This implied motion is what it's called. So be able to discuss how this painting did start to influence the American modernist by coming over into what was called the Armory Show, and then also how it combines the analytic cubist elements as well as the futurism elements. Okay, and then what's going to come out of this Armory Show is something called precisionism. Precisionism, and that's Precisionism. Precisionism. And what precisionism is about is it's very much like the synthetic cubism, meaning that they were taking these very simple shapes and forms and then kind of collaging them together. It's the same kind of concept with the precisionism, but they're inspired by the machine of the industrial age. So they're interested in like the practical, precise measurements that you'll see with a machine whenever it's in the industrial warehouse doing its job. And if you look at figure 30.6, Davis hot still scape for 6 colors, 7th Avenue style, it has that synthetic cubist almost collage feel to it, where everything's boiled down to these basic shapes, but then they're overlapping almost in a very much like a three-dimensional collage. But all the different shapes are supposed to reflect like precise cuts and angles, and almost like the leftover sheet metal that you might find after it's been cut down by a machine in a factory that is fabricating and manipulating stainless steel or sheet metal. Okay, so precisionism is coming from the precise nature of the modernist industrial revolution that's occurring at this time. Now, you're going to have artists like that, what we just saw with Davis, which is very obvious and definitely is starting to move into that vein of more modernistic work, really embracing that abstraction that we saw with the Cubist as well as the Futurist. And we're starting to see that develop over here in America. But then you're also going to have artists during this precisionism period that are going to take the concept of things looking precise like from the machine, but then alter them just a little bit more and begin as precisionists, but then kind of move away from it and become more organicist, if you will. And that first one is Georgia O'Keeffe, figure 30.8, O'Keeffe. New York Night, 1929. And she started as a precisionist and became a leader in this avant-garde in America. Now, prior to O'Keeffe and some others like Davis, the whole idea of avant-garde was resisted, like I talked about. Okay, and it's going to be resisted even more in different regions of America, and I'll talk about that. So she was a precisionist, and then she started these pieces, and she moved to the city, coming from rural Wisconsin, made her way to New York City, and embraced again the industrialization and the city life that was being generated out of this new love for modernism in America, something that was already developing over in Europe. So she became a leader of this avant-garde decision of making artwork called the precisionist. And then she activated the fast pace of that machine-like lifestyle in these cityscapes. All right. So whenever she first, now she's known for southwestern, like New Mexico, skulls from different deer as well as bull and flowers and landscapes is what she's ultimately going to be known for. But she started that with kind of a telescopic vision into the city landscape first. And so here's one of her very first pieces of New York Night, 1929. So she uses the skyscraper as a theme. All right, it's meant to be a theme. And what that theme is supposed to symbolize is that of the modern world. So that's why she's really focusing on the skyscraper, all right? It's almost like a cityscape instead of a landscape, right? So you would see a landscape as an open field like we saw with some of the realist painters, and taking that concept and then focusing on the cityscape, which is what we see here with Georgia O'Keeffe. And like a precisionist, she reduced the items or the objects to simple planes, like the skyscrapers, into simple rectangles. And the overall structure of them are kind of flat and simple, not two-dimensional. There's a little bit of dimensionality in the street on the bottom left where there's a little bit of light, but it's mostly flat and very simple planes, all right? Planes being just like a flat sheet. But she punctuates it with small rectangular windows. So she emphasizes the building with those small little lights. And those are like your little illuminated glows of brilliance in regards to what's going on with her her embrace of the modern world. Remember, using the skyscraper as a symbol of embrace for the modern world, and then those little lights of rectangles of the cityscape inside of the skyscraper are little beacons of hope for the modern world, if you will. All right, so she's punctuating her symbolism of the skyscraper of the modern world with those rectilinear windows, and it's creating certain patterns and designs. All right. Then what's going to happen in America is the big stock market is going to crash. Wall Street is going to crash. The big commerce capital of the world is really going to crash. And the Great Depression is going to kick in, and a lot of people are going to become very, very poor. And with that, the art market is going to disappear as well, and it's really going to be hit really, really hard. But a couple things are going to come out of the art world, essentially being almost disappearing during this time in America, in the United States. And it's actually something that's going to continue all the way to this day. And the fact is that today, if you build large for a municipality, a certain percentage has to go towards public artwork, like 1%. And it started actually in Hawaii. Hawaii was was the first state that approved this 1% of any new federal buildings being built. A percentage of it has to go to the to public art. So That's going to develop, and what those are called is the Treasury Relief Art Project, as well as Works Progress Administration, WPA. And what they're going to do is have the government buy art for federal buildings. So anytime a federal building is built, they're going to buy artwork to fill up that space, either sculptures in the atrium, paintings in the atrium, paintings throughout the hallways, wherever it might be. A percentage of their money through those two acts, the WPA and the Treasury Relief Art Project, is going to pay artists to make work. And also during this time, in the 40s, the 35 through 45, 35 to 45, a lot of European artists are going to leave Europe and move to New York City. Even Salvador Dali, very famous artists, are going to move over here. Duchamp is going to move over here. And the reason for that is Adolf Hitler and what was going on in Europe at that time. So the artists escaped. And so with that, with all these European artists being in America, the American modernist movement is really going to ramp up. All right, it's really going to ramp up. And I just wanted to let you know that and keep you informed that there's going to be a lot going on that's going to embrace the European modernists, because those folks are going to be living in America during that time. So you're going to see lots of shows from Dali and from others that are going to engage the American scene, especially in the big cities. And Hopper here, figure 30.9, Edward Hopper, Nighthawks, is an example of being influenced by some of these modernists. And it's still on the cusp of the realism, but it does embrace some elements of abstraction to it. The main abstraction is going to be the flatness that we see with the precisionism of the architecture in the background, back into the darkness to the left, which is something O'Keeffe did as well in her New York scape that we just looked at. So that's going to be an emphasis of it as well. But where you have a lot of the light that's emanating in the space in the center of the canvas over to the right is going to be more of a American realism approach to painting. And so let me break it down for you here. So what Hopper's doing is he's using contemporary scenes of city and country. He didn't just do cityscapes, he also did countryscapes. But this is one of his most well recognized, the Nighthawks. And what he wanted to do is he wanted to show empty space with muted buildings. And that's what the abstraction is to create this muted like building. So if you look at the architecture on the outside of the window as well as the architecture in the background, it's muted. It doesn't have a lot of emphasis or detail to it. It's not until you look at the light on the inside of the cafe that you see where some definition is starting to build up. So he's muting the architecture and creating empty space. All right. And what this is supposed to do with the empty space and the muted buildings is to reflect the Great Depression that was going on in America and how it was coming out of it. Okay. It crashed in 29, and this painting is a reflection on how long that Great Depression has affected America. And it really wasn't until got into World War II that things started to kind of bounce back, which was America entered the war in, it began in 1939, but I believe America entered the war, United States, in 1941. So it really wasn't until then that we see a change in the Depression. So anyway, the empty space and the muted buildings are supposed to reflect that element of depression from the Great Depression, which is going to also be seen in what's called overwhelming loneliness and echoing isolation. So it looks like the figures in the scene have stopped in motion, as well as it looks like time has been suspended. So time and motion has ceased, which again is a reflection of that Great Depression. And then he wants to create this paradoxical window. So the window that we see, we have to assume that there's a window there, right? That's separating the figures that are inside the cafe and outside. It's paradoxical, meaning that it looks as if they're safe on the inside, but they're still very much exposed, which is kind of the idea of this Great Depression, is that you feel safe within, during this time, you feel safe that you're within America because all this war is going on in Europe, but you're also very exposed at the same time because the Great Depression has made people very poor, though you're living in a country that is not being decimated by war. So it's kind of paradoxical, right? And he's also making sure that the people are indifferent, so they look indifferent between each other. And again, the use of simple shapes, okay, that he uses to make sure that everything's muted. So not over elaborated. It's all an expansion of the idea of the Great Depression. Okay. Now, a couple more things are going to happen. We're going to have Harlem Renaissance. That's going to happen in Harlem, New York, which is going to be the vitalization of African American artwork during this time. And we're also going to have something called regionalism, which is going to kind of be a backlash to a lot of these American realism as well as American modernist painters. So let's begin in Harlem, and we're going to take a look at 3010, Jacob Lawrence, number 49, from The Migration of the Negro, 1940 to 1941. And what's happening in the Harlem Renaissance is the rise of African American art. And the emphasis of this African American art is to promote their cultural accomplishments and also to promote racial tolerance during this time. So the artwork is supposed to expose these socio-political elements of creating tolerance and equality, and the African American art is what is going to propel this. And the Harlem Renaissance is a rebirth of the importance of the African American art. And Lawrence here in figure 3010 is going to be one of the leaders of the pack. So what Jacob Lawrence did, is he moved to Harlem, New York, just like what we saw with Georgia O'Keeffe. She moved from Wisconsin, and Lawrence is moving from the south and making his way up to New York City versus O'Keeffe. She came from the northern countries, the northern states in Wisconsin. Anyway, Lawrence is going to move to Harlem, and he's going to embrace and learn and study all the great writers during this Harlem Renaissance period, like Langston Hughes, and he's going to really embrace all the literature to promote the importance of African American accomplishments in the United States. And so he's going to make a series, and he's also going to study Goya. If you remember Goya, he was the Romantic painter that did 1808, May 5th, 1808. And it was about how the Spanish were invaded by the French invaders. And it was supposed to generate this empathy for the Spanish that were there to try to force the French out. And Lawrence is going to look a lot at Goya's work, and that is going to give him the socio-political drive coupled with his studies and embrace of African American accomplishments in the arts and writing and in theater and in the arts themselves, the visual arts. And he's going to couple all that together and give rise to a series of 60 paintings, and they're called The Migration of the Negro, and this is number 49, figure 3010. And what these 60 paintings are supposed to define is the continuing struggle against discrimination. As you see, that there's this line that is dividing everything, but it's not a straight up in line. It's like this movement that goes one way and then it goes the other way, and it's like it's constantly undulating. You don't know when it's finally going to straighten up so that you can lift it up and move it, right? It keeps moving on them, right? It keeps moving on everyone. And you have folks on both sides that are trying to get this division removed, but it keeps moving, and that's why it is this continuing struggle against discrimination. And so he creates this waving line to first show a little bit of depth, but also to make it symbolic, like it keeps shifting too much and it's hard to get a hold of. It's like trying to wrestle a snake so you can just throw it out. So it's a deliberate attempt to show how challenging it is to remove this division line that is unacceptable. Because if you look at the figures to the left, their backs are to the figures to the right, and they look disgruntled, and then the figures to the right are just trying to be at peace and everybody just try to have their meals right in peace. So this division line is creating this unfortunate dichotomy that is something that Lawrence is going to be using through all of his 60 panels to discuss. And again, socio-political discussions, just like Goya did during the Romantic period in Spain. So they're also going to depict ongoing exodus of black labor from the southern states, which is something that Lawrence was part of. He moved north. He moved up to Harlem, New York, and he came from the south. And he's going to emphasize through this series of 60 paintings the importance of black entrepreneurship and African American accomplishments as they were coming up out of the South, where they were in a very unfortunate circumstance. And by moving north, they were able to develop and create more accomplishments. But still, there's that struggle of discrimination coming from other sides that Lawrence is wanting to present and allow people to see in America, that this is something that is not over, but it is something that still needs to be recognized and discussed. And then during the Harlem Renaissance, we're also going to have a group of American painters called regionalists. And we're going to look at figure 3011. You've probably seen this before. Grant Wood, American Gothic. And he is going to generate the term called regionalism. 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 And they're going to be known as scene painters, like SCENE, like a scene in theater. Scene painters. And they are going to be all about the anti-modern life. The whole city life, not interested. The whole big modern machine and the Industrial Revolution, not interested. Okay, they're going to be interested in rural life America. And here, for example, Wood is painting out of the state of Iowa, which is one of the leading farming states in the country, in the United States. And he believes that the rural life America is actually the backbone of the United States. So the farmers are the backbones of the United States, and regionalism is going to embrace that concept of the rural life being the backbone. And the scene paintings like American Gothic are supposed to reflect and emphasize that. Now, with American Gothic, and why it's called Gothic is because that window. It's because of that one window on the very far back in the center, between their heads, on the very top of the cornice of the roof. It is a Gothic window, and it's meant to show their connection to the churches and religious piety. So Gothic period was a time period in late medieval that emphasized and embraced the importance of your religiosity and your piety to God. And here it's being used, this Gothic window, to show that these individuals, these farmers in the United States, are very pious and very religious, and that's what they're going to embrace. They're not going to embrace a modern machine called industrialism. Okay, they're more interested in their connection to God. So Wood incorporates this Gothic window to emphasize that, using a little bit of art history to create art history, if you will. Because now that this painting has become art history, it emphasizes the connect back to the Gothic period, which was heavily present in France during that time. And they also have dour expressions to reject the avant-garde styles that were being developed at this time, like the precisionism that was being embraced during this time, even the American realism that was derived from the European realism. So really kind of pushing that away as well. Any abstractions was considered avant-garde, and the regionalist had nothing to do with that. They also alienated their figures. Their figures look a little alienated, like they're not accepted, because of the increase of abstraction art that's going on in the country at this time with the American modernists. So this painting is supposed to show their guard against these avant-garde movements, which in turn is actually, like with that pitchfork, in turn it's actually alienating them from the rest of the world or the rest of the country and what's going on. But it's at the same time supposed to give a sense of nostalgia for anybody who's actually lived in these rural rural states in America and the United States during this time. So it's supposed to create more nostalgic feeling for folks that are working class in the on the farms in these states, but then it's also supposed to create a sense of alienation from the wild modernism and abstractions and industrialism that's going on the coast, in particular the East Coast, and then also the slow developments happening on the West Coast. All right, so I'll leave it at that, and then we'll get into Mexico and how modernism is developing in Mexico, and then also talk a little bit about architecture.